for people who are involved in making place. The first question they need to ask themselves is, when they're making a place, who's doing the making, and what is their role really? Is it to make a place, or is it to facilitate the best use of the space to do the best for context and community? And if one sees oneself as, an architect or urbanist, as a place maker, isn't that quite sort of egocentric in a way? And isn't there an opportunity just to step back from thinking of oneself as a place maker, just maybe a place enabler, maybe, or facilitator in some way?
Hello and welcome to Talking Place, the podcast bringing placemakers and storytellers together to talk about place. I'm your host, Tanisha Raffiuddin. I am the founder of Concept Culture, a creative agency in London, passionate about creating purposeful brands and telling powerful stories. In this episode, it is my absolute pleasure to talk place with the enigmatic Marsha Ramroop. Marsha runs her own strategic inclusion consultancy called Unheard and is passionate about driving change in the built environment and engineering sectors. Marsha leverages cultural intelligence to close the gap between intention and action, ensuring that policies and practices are genuinely inclusive. Marsha is also the author of the groundbreaking book, Building Inclusion, a practical guide to equity, diversity, and inclusion in architecture and the built environment. We cover a lot of ground in this episode around how to approach creating inclusive places from an EDI and cultural intelligence lens, how developers can build trust with their communities, and why it's time for the industry to do things differently to get different results. All right, let's talk place. Marsha, welcome to Talking Place, the podcast where we bring placemakers and storytellers together to talk about place.
Thank you so much, Tanisha, for having me. I'm very much looking forward to speaking to you about place and inclusion and anything you have to ask me about anything. I'm an open book.
Amazing. Thank you, Marsha. So let's start, obviously, from the top. I've known you for a number of years now through working with women in architecture, and most recently helping you promote the fabulous Building Inclusion book. But if there's someone out there who doesn't know who Marsha Ramroop is, tell us who Marsha Ramroop is.
Don't you know who I am? Is the first question I'll ask back. So Marsha Ramroop is, I am an inclusion strategist. I work cross-sector, but I have particular passion for the built environment because I fundamentally believe that if we don't have inclusive spaces, we can't have inclusive society and inclusive world, because the way that we are as humans is fundamentally impacted by the space and place and buildings and landscape that has been shaped by humans. And so there are lots of things around that need to be influenced with good expertise around inclusion. So I've come into the sector for this mission, if you like. And I'm also a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, and I am very much purpose-led in everything that I do. And I'm now an author, as you mentioned.
Amazing. And I think that's also what attracted us to each other. And that's why we started working together, because we're both purpose-led and mission-driven. Our missions might be slightly different, but they're all connected to placemaking and creating inclusive and sustainable places. So obviously you weren't in the built environment. Now you're in the built environment. What was that journey like?
Yeah, I had a 30-year career in broadcasting before I ended up in full-time inclusion work. And it does come, up quite often. How do you work in radio and then end up in inclusion? And there's a bit of a joke actually at the beginning of my book where my girls used to take the mickey out of me because I once said this out loud, and then they started taking the mickey out of me, saying I said that radio is what I want to do, but inclusion is what I need to do. And it's a nice little soundbite. And I tend to say things and they come out my mouth and I think, oh gosh, that's a really great thing that I just said. And then they started taking the biggie. This is mid-Atlantic sort of American thing. Radio is what I want to do, but inclusion is what I need to do. You can just imagine two teenagers taking it every time I mention radio or inclusion. So that's them, but that is precisely what it is. So my business is called Unheard Voice because fundamentally my motto, my mission statement, if you like, is giving the unheard voice a place to speak. So working in radio, working in broadcasting for me was always about how do I go into communities and support storytelling, recognizing that the people that we're serving should be directing how we do that. So going into communities, asking them what are their stories, how do they want them told, facilitating media literacy projects. This was in the early 2000s, so literally showing them how to use cameras, how to use MP3 recorders, and then supporting them through the editing process as well, so that it was very much their stories that then lived on BBC platforms. And then as I became a leader and a manager, supporting people in their careers, making sure that a diversity of people coming in and then they were supported in those careers. So we weren't just saying, yeah, here we are. Okay, it's up to you now. So really recognizing there was a bit of a shift there, that and a bridge building that was required. So I did all of those things. And then, of course, things like inclusive recruitment programs and inclusive reporting schemes, training as well. So I've done all that variety of things. And then I've brought that practice into the built environment and written about it in the book.
And the built environment is very, very lucky to have you. That's all I'll say. Okay, so this is a podcast about place. So what does place mean to you? And what makes a good place?
It's a really good question. I suppose if I were to give it a definition, what is place? For me, I'd say it's anywhere that there is a human. So I think that in the absence of a human means that it's not a place. So there's something that changes an environment into a place as a result of the human presence. And I haven't really thought about this in I suppose the academic sense that some other people have, but when I'm thinking about inclusion, because of course that's what I think about all the time, inclusive spaces and inclusive places for me is what kind of thinking and collaboration and co-creation and dignity and authenticity and transparency and compromise. Certainly that idea of a joint thinking process. That for me is what inclusive place is. And I think if I'm to think about where places are for me and important places for me, it's where I have those human connections. So I've lived in a lot of places. One of my friends used to joke that they had an address book just for me, from the age of sort of 18 through to even 35. I must have lived in about 15 places in that time, just every sort of 6 months bouncing around. Yeah, and I don't have that same connection with, or I didn't think I did. So what brought this to the fore was I grew up in Harrow, and I lived there till I was 18. Then I went to university in Birmingham, and then I came back to Harrow. And then after that, I went traveling around the world. And then when I came back, moved up to Leeds, Birmingham, came back to Derby, bounced around Derby, lived in Manchester. And relatively recently, I found myself back in Harrow. I was in the childhood home, which my mother still owns and now lets. And I was in my childhood home. And there was this incredible sense of familiarity and probably some nostalgia. And even though Harrow itself has changed so much, I felt this warmth, I suppose, towards it. And maybe a sense of home that I didn't realise I missing it? I probably wasn't missing it, but there was this added warmth, I suppose, from being in that building and being in that area and being in that place. And so, and that's when I kind of realised there was something about the connection with the community then, which for me was about, I wouldn't mind investing my time and my energy in this place, because that for me was about something else that I talk about in the book very briefly called social affection, which is about loving where you live and having that warmth of place, and us needing to develop that a lot more in order to make great places to live for each other as well as in this in the sector.
Wow. Oh, I love that. This warmth of place and social affection. I mean, I think that's what it is, right? Home is where the heart is. And my next question was going to be, what is your favorite place? So I'm wondering if it's Harrow now, based on what you
Yeah,
just said, or one
yes.
of the other 15 places.
Yeah, well, it is, isn't it? I mean, as an amazing place to be and visit and live, New Zealand was quite special. That's 25 years ago. I was there. Spent quite a few months there. But yeah, no, favorite place at the moment really is with my family, with my daughters, my husband in Derby. Derby is a special place in that the way that we describe it is that it's big enough to matter, small enough to care. And because it's the home of planes, trains, and automobiles, so you've got Rolls-Royce engines made here, you've got trains made here, you've got Toyota car making. It's great. You can never go into town and not see someone that you know. It takes 15 minutes to walk across the centre of town. And yes, it's called a city because it was made a municipal city in 1977 with the Queen's Jubilee.
I do share with you the love for New Zealand, because I visited New Zealand when I went on my travels and my around the world trip. And when anyone asks me that question, I also somehow I say New Zealand. And there's something about that country, at the end of the world on a 2D map. I'll caveat that, but it just feels like there's something so magical about. Well, this is now the natural world, not necessarily the built world. About the landscape there, because it just feels like this is how time has always been. This is how nature has always been. And this time, no limited human intervention. And I think that's what, for me, was so magical about that place. And that's why I have those strong memories of, hiking there and encountering birds and animals that you will never see anywhere else. Because, birds there don't fly. They have everything they need in New Zealand. And yeah, I think so. Thank you for sharing that, because that's also triggered a nice memory for me as well. So we have one more thing in common. We do have a love for New Zealand. Who knew?
Who knew?
Who knew? Amazing. Okay, so you've touched a little bit about your work about inclusion, but now for our audience, and now we're looking for definitions. Most people would know about the field called EDI or DEI, depending on where you live or where you work. But can you break down what EDI means and what each letter stands for people who are not in the EDI space?
Certainly. So EDI, so if we go with that way round, E is equity, D is diversity, I is inclusion. But I will define them in a different order. So I'm going to start with diversity, because a lot of people talk about diversity. They have heads of diversity who talk about, diversity equals better business outcomes, etc., etc. So diversity is simply the fact of visible and invisible difference. So everyone is part of diversity. It's not just about what we call protected characteristics. So protected characteristics is a list of 9 sort of legal definitions from the Equality Act 2010, and it includes things like race and belief and age and sexuality and gender assignment and disability, etc. There's maternity in there as well. So there's a number of different things there. But for me, when we're talking about diversity, what we really mean is addressing underrepresentation. And it's really important that I think we talk about underrepresentation rather than diversity, because it's that really focuses the mind. Who isn't in the room? Who should be part of our leadership that isn't part of our leadership team? Why aren't they part of our leadership team? So when we're talking about underrepresentation, it's a far more useful term. Diversity is simply a fact of humanity, of visible and invisible difference, things that you can be discriminated against, and which you may not necessarily. So it can be access to technology. It can be whether you have access to public transport, green space. All of these different things are part of who we are, what makes us who we are. And so diversity is that mix. So that's the fact of visible and invisible difference. Inclusion is the act where everyone is valued, respected, and accepted for who they are, recognizing everyone is the way they are because they are. We're all products of our education, our background, our experiences. And so inclusion is really where the work needs to be if we're going to address issues of underrepresentation. Equity is different from equality in that equality is about everyone getting the same, which is fine if we're all at the same start point, but as we recognize through historic issues, addressing individual needs, that is what the equity piece is. So equity is about making up for historic imbalance and, seeking to address individual needs, which are the outcomes as well from when you address underrepresentation with inclusive cultures, you reach equitable outcomes. And that is the journey that this work is about. And a lot of people then talk about, belonging. You should belong at work or feel like you belong in your role. That I have a slightly different issue with, because belonging for me is a personal choice, not an organizational imperative. So I may choose to belong at work, but that's up to me. If my organization is thinking about how it wants to treat me, it should be thinking about inclusion, because I may or may not want to belong at work. I may want to go back to the idea of place, belong at home, or belong in a solitary place, or belong with my sports team. That's where I get my sense of belonging. I may or may not tie that to work. So from an organizational perspective, from a leadership perspective, having the act of inclusion is really important. And inclusion isn't about other people and their identities or characteristics. It's about us and our behaviours. What is it about me? What is it about our leadership team? What is it about our organisation? What is it about our sector that needs to change so we can be more inclusive of you, whoever you are, because we're all made up of multiple identities. So if we're trying to do this for race over there, that for gender over there, that for sexuality, that for disability, we're kind of missing the point, because underrepresentation is a symptom. So we need to deal with the cause, which is a lack of inclusive behaviour and culture. So we need to be looking at inclusion through the lens of behaviours and how we're going to develop inclusive cultures. And that's what I do.
Well, thank you so much for breaking that down, because I remember the first time I heard this from you. And to me, as naive as I was, I thought the EDI all worked together. But then when you reframed the discussion of how you lead through the lens of inclusion, and then that made me take a step back and think about, right, it's about how I behave as well with someone, how I react to someone. If someone is treating me in a way that I am uncomfortable, and it happens all the time, we live in multicultural Britain, I don't always have to react in a strong way. I can choose to ignore the comment, or I can choose to walk away from an uncomfortable situation. But maybe I can ask you that. So why is it? Where did this acronym come about? Why are they? There's three different words, three different things. Is it helpful to have them all together?
I increasingly do not wish to use the term. I mean, it's on the front of my book, that Building Inclusion is a practical guide to equity, diversity and inclusion in architecture and the built environment. And it is that. But increasingly, I prefer to talk about culture and behaviours. The terms are historic and they've moved across, and you would have noticed that you would have seen a lot more with the B of belonging coming in there as well, DEIB, which like I say, I'm really railing against. But they do work together, because in order to achieve equitable outcomes, you need to break down the systems which create the underrepresentation. Underrepresentation is a lack of diversity in that, to that point about it's just the mix of invisible difference. But at the moment, we have overrepresentation of a particular demographic, which tends to be the white, a heteronormative male who's able-bodied and normally sort of city-centred as well, not even rural, or certainly London-centric when it comes to built environment. And so they do work together in that I tend to say diversity is the fact, inclusion is the act, equity is the impact. When cultural intelligence is unpacked, and cultural intelligence is the behavioural framework then to deliver on inclusive behaviours and culture. So they do work together. Again, another analogy that I tend to use is that of the journey. So if diversity is the landscape and inclusion is the road through it to our destination of equitable outcomes, then cultural intelligence is the best vehicle to get us there. That's the kind of analogy that I would share. And so there is a relationship between them all, but recognizing that we shouldn't be focusing on the diversity per se, it is the underrepresentation. And so whilst we keep on talking about diversity, and then the fallacy that diversity equals better business outcomes, that isn't true. So diversity only equals better business outcomes when that diversity is managed well in inclusive cultures. So again, to that point where we've got a lot of initiatives attracting a diversity people into our professions in the built environment, and it's all well and good attracting diversity and addressing underrepresentation of women and racialized groups and those who are disabled by society and so on. All of those groups coming into the sector and then not being supported by any structural, procedural change in our education or organisations or sector, they're just leaving. So that's why we need inclusive behaviours and culture. And fundamentally, when you have inclusive behaviours and culture, it automatically leads to diversity and addressing of underrepresentation in the first place. So that's why I'm so invested in making sure we're doing things and changing those structures that create the problems in the first place.
I'm so with you. And I actually haven't heard of DEIB yet, but maybe it will surface on our LinkedIn soon. But I loved how you broke it down simply. And I think a lot of, what the work I do is storytelling and communication is like breaking down complex jargon into simple ways. And I think, if diversity is the fact, inclusion is the act, and equity is the impact. Now I can see how they all work together. And then obviously the cultural intelligence. So you introduce a new term. So again, for someone who's listening who may never have heard of this term before, what is cultural intelligence?
So cultural intelligence, also known as CQ. So Q stands for quotient because it's a measure as well as an improvable skill. The actual definition of it is the capability to work and relate effectively across cultural difference. So across difference. And it's a capability, so it's an improvable skill. It's about working and functioning. So it's about doing, but it's also about relating. So it's about relationships. It's about being. It's about people and effectiveness. So really having those relationships and functioning well across that difference. So recognizing different perspectives, different backgrounds, beliefs, business systems, leadership styles, you name it. To that point about what diversity is, it's simply the mix of visible and invisible difference. If you can relate effectively across all of those things and have the capability to improve that, that's what makes you culturally intelligent. So CQ as a scale has been around for about 2 decades now. It's been researched across 170 different countries around the world. More than 300,000 people across the world have taken assessments as to what is their cultural intelligence. And it comes down to, if you want to be capable and have the capability to work and relate effectively across difference, you need 4 capabilities. And the first is motivation, your drive. Do you actually want to work and relate effectively across difference? And a lot of people say, yes, of course we do. But when the stuff hits a fan, when you're fearful, when you're defensive, when you're uncomfortable, then that stops you from being motivated. So how do you motivate yourself under those circumstances and remain confident when you make mistakes as well, to own up to those and do those sorts of behaviours transparently? The second capability is knowledge. What do you need to know about a variety of backgrounds, belief systems, everything? You can never know everything about everything and everything about everyone. And so that's why it's so important to listen to and surround yourself with that difference, especially when it feels like that difference is quite alien to your own perspective. The third capability is the most important, because if you're motivated and you have some knowledge and you go straight into action without stopping to think about what you're thinking about, then you'll act tokenistically and stereotypically. So that third capability is called strategy. And it's about planning for interactions. It's about being hugely self-aware, about power dynamics, racial dynamics, gender dynamics, just being, recognizing that other biases might be at play. And so it's in strategy that you create procedural change to mitigate the impact of bias. And you also need to check your assumptions in there as well. And then the fourth capability is action. Ultimately, people judge us on our behaviors. And those who are high in cultural intelligence action have a broad repertoire of adaptable behaviors in order to be effective at working, relating across difference. So that's why I use that framework, because it's proven, it's academically robust, that if you behave with cultural intelligence using those four capabilities, practicing and improving them, you will behave inclusively, and then you can bring those into play in organizational behaviors as well. And that's where you can improve your cultures in an organization as well.
Fascinating. I remember actually I learned the term cultural intelligence from you from first. I saw it post on LinkedIn, and that got me thinking about it and got me interested in researching about it. So to recap, the four capabilities are motivation, knowledge, strategy, and action.
That's right. And in my book, Building Inclusion, one of the things that I do, apart from just obviously outlining everything I've just said and talking about how to apply it, each of the case studies that are featured, there's something called a behavioral analysis at the end of each of them, where I describe the drive, knowledge, strategy, and action that have been put into place for that case study, and some of the kind of things, the takeaways, that even though that particular case study doesn't seem relevant to your work, it's the behavioral analysis then is questions that you can ask yourself that then does make that case study relevant to who you are and what you're trying to do.
Amazing. So now coming back to placemaking. So we've unpacked the various definitions. We've learned about EDI, we've learned about cultural intelligence. So for the placemakers out there who may be listening, what is your advice to them to enable them or to help them create more inclusive places?
Yeah, it's such an important question for people who are involved in making place. And I think really importantly is to then, the first question they need to ask themselves is, when they're making a place, who's doing the making? And what is their role really? Is it to make a place, or is it to facilitate the best use of the space to do the best for context and community? And if one sees oneself as an architect or urbanist, as a place maker, isn't that quite sort of egocentric in a way? And isn't there an opportunity just to step back from thinking of oneself as a place maker, just maybe a place enabler, maybe, or facilitator in some way? And in that respect, in order to give good, place proper value in people, place and planet, when we're trying to adapt our environment for best uses, I really, really, really would strongly recommend listening to voices that you may well have not listened to before. I think when it comes to if you're in planning, if you're in councils, you tend to go to the loudest voices. Those are the most accessible. The residents associations, who are incredibly powerful in a lot of situations. Are they really who you should be listening to? What about the single parent who has to hold down 2 or 3 jobs, working the gig economy to pay the bills? How are you going to engage with them? Because they're not going to stop and do your survey and fill in your form, or use their data on their phone to do your interactive quiz. They're the ones whose lives need to be made easier, so they can build some social affection and really invest in where they live as well, because they're very much part of that local economy and community. And so there's several things that you need to think about when it comes to that. So it's very much about listening. I mean, that's just one example of the kinds of people that you might find it difficult to engage with, but find ways you must, because they're probably more in the majority than you think, and they're just silenced by not having access to the opportunities that that are presented in terms of changing where a place might be developed.
Fascinating. And I love what you said about the term placemaker, and could that be egocentric. I think I feel like that's another LinkedIn post after this podcast goes live. But that's a point thought. Propagation is a point of propagation. Like, is placemaking? I've had several conversations, a lot of people talking about, is placemaking the right word? Maybe it's place shaping, but place enabling now. Let's talk about that. I think that sounds great as well. Place facilitating. I think a lot of people who work in the space do act as facilitators and custodians and guardians of places. But to your point, it is all about listening and not just listening for the sake of listening, but taking what you've heard and putting it into action. I think that's also what placemakers, place enablers, place facilitators, however we want to call them, should be looking at. And your practice is called Unheard Voice. And I recently heard through now, we're doing a lot of place branding work, and we're hearing about the unheard voices. We're hearing about, and you've touched upon this, the hard to ignore voices as well. So how would one deal with the hard to ignore voices? Because, you've got a lot of advice out there on how to address the unheard voice. What about the hard to ignore voice?
Yeah, so the loudest voices, not that they don't necessarily have anything useful to say, but I think that it's also recognizing that they enjoy their place of privilege and power to, have their voice heard. So I'm never an advocate for ignoring anyone. I tend to say it's not either or, it's got to be this and. So yes, we're going to listen to what you have to say, but bear in mind, we also have to listen to what this other group has to say. And where there's conflict in that, we then have to look at, well, again, what are we trying to create here, and focus on the outcomes that we're looking to achieve together, and find the best way forward. There will always be some kind of compromise. But, if we're going to collaborate well, we have to be clear about everyone's views here, not just the ones that are being represented at this particular time. So, in fact, chapter 7 of Building Inclusion is particularly good on these points, recognizing that these are the barriers, recognizing that those who aren't speaking up aren't necessarily for a number of reasons. Some of them might be historic, and there's a lot of baggage. There's going to be issues around trust. There's going to be issues around, well, look, you're the developers, you've got the billions, I've got nothing. Who's really going to have any kind of power in this situation? It's not going to be me. So there's no point me even wasting my energy kind of narrative. But those who do have the loudest voices, let's not ignore them. They do have valid things to say. It's just also recognizing that needs to be balanced with those who we aren't otherwise listening to.
Absolutely. And you touched upon trust, which is very important when it comes to placemaking, and particularly the reputation of developer. For the developers listening out there, what's your take on this? Do you have any advice for them on how they could help build that trust?
Yes, I mean, to use the trust equation by Meister, Green and Golford, which was from 2001, which is trust is credibility plus reliability plus intimacy. That's what trust is. So, doing what you say you will, having that integrity, showing up, delivering in the way that you say you will. And then vulnerability is that intimacy piece is about authenticity, is about recognizing when you get things wrong, and holding your hands up and saying, we got this wrong, we need to move forward differently. It's about listening, learning, reflecting, and responding appropriately. And I think any developer that digs their heels in when they've got something wrong, and quite sort of intransigent in those times, that you're not going to do anything to build trust in that respect. I also worry as well. I mean, the legislation doesn't help. Planning says that you go to planning after you've come up with an idea of what you're going to do. Well, actually, I do think there's probably something different that needs to happen there, where, with a level of co-creation, you're more likely to get through planning, where you work with a community, with a context, to see what would work out for the best. And I realise when money comes into play, people don't see, it can be a bit intangible, a lot of that consultation and that engagement, I think, rather than consultation. But it definitely would make things a lot easier to put that investment in earlier, rather than looking to fight battles down the line. And we have this issue at the moment around planning, getting things through planning, there's some issues about number of houses that need to be built, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we're going to be effective at doing these things well, we have to do them differently. We can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. If you want things to change, you have to change how you do them. It's Einstein that quote is attributed to him. The definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But actually, what he said was, we need a new type of thinking if humankind is to succeed and to survive and to reach higher levels, a new type of thinking. And so if you want a new type of thinking, that requires change early on. Look at the way that you currently do things and flip it, change it, and you will get different outcomes, because it's been proven. There are a number of examples where you get that engagement in early and then you take that to planning, rather than getting your idea made in some ivory tower somewhere by people who think they know best and presenting that, and then going through a statutory 21-day consultation where you just put up a notice somewhere and rolled up to the local community centre and no one turned up, because of course no one knew to turn up apart from maybe the local residents association, and that's all you've got. And you said, well, tick that box. And then you get objections. It's going to be the same thing over and over again. So let's try it differently, and maybe we'll get some more houses built in ways that are appropriate and satisfied the needs.
So new ways of thinking, reflect, listen, learn, and run good engagement before you go to planning. I guess that sums it up. I feel like I don't want to touch planning, because planning would be a whole other hour conversation, not more. And there's enough of discourse out there about how the UK planning system needs to be overhauled. But I think you mapped it out in a very logical way. So for the developers listening out there, you may want to go back and listen to that bit again.
Or read chapter 7.
Read chapter 7 of Building Inclusion, the book. So we have talked about what an inclusive place means to you. I guess I'd like to know if there are any examples out there of places that you've been to or experienced that you've thought, oh, hang on, yes, this is really an inclusive place.
That's a really, really good question. And I feel like I don't think of it enough, partly because I have the privilege of being very fit and walking around with a level of confidence. And it's only after, on reflection, when someone asks me, was that an inclusive place? I think, oh gosh, you know what? Once again, in the blithe way that I can live my life, I wasn't conscious of whether it was inclusive or not. It's only, if I'm carrying a big case or something, I think, oh gosh, I can really imagine how this would be different. I was lucky enough to be on a panel recently with Engineers Without Borders UK, and with me on the panel was this incredible guy who's the CEO of a disability charity. His name escapes me right now. It'll come to me in a second. And he's a wheelchair user, grew up with not having use of his legs. And he said that when he was on the Elizabeth line, it was like after a lifetime of not being really able to use the tube for so many different reasons, it was almost like he felt like crying when he used the Elizabeth line for the first time, because it was such a liberating experience. He was able to get from A to B with the ease that I just talked about, being blithely able to travel through spaces. And I thought that was really, really powerful to hear, because for that reason that we can do it. We can, if something like the Elizabeth line can be created where a man feels like he can just live his life, get from A to B like we all want to, that's powerful. And I think in terms of really listening to those who otherwise don't normally have access to spaces, they're the ones who can best tell us where inclusive spaces are. And on top of that, I would recommend people check out some of the work that's being done in Vienna around what they call gender mainlining, I think, and which is about creating well, it's gender inclusive insofar as they're mostly women involved in the decision making. But ultimately, when it's inclusive of one group, it tends to be inclusive of many more because you've got wider open spaces for prioritizing things like pushchairs. Well, of course, then that helps wheelchairs. It helps with people who have got luggage. It just generally makes it easier to navigate for so many people, for example. So yeah, that's probably the Elizabeth line and Vienna.
Amazing. I actually can relate to that example because I was involved in a skiing accident a number of years ago, and I was on crutches for a couple of weeks, and I had to navigate the underground. Work from home didn't exist back then. And with the crutches, the London Underground was one of the most scariest places to be with crutches. And honestly, it was very, very scary. And then I did then have such a transformative experience. And then now when I see people with, in wheelchairs with crutches, I'm very empathetic towards their situation because for a short period of time, I was in that situation. And I agree. I think the Elizabeth line is an excellent example. It's winning awards left, right, and center. When it first was launched, I'm going to say 2023, everyone loved it. And I think it's now a really important part of London's story, its infrastructure story, and the way we get around. What I will always say is one of the best cities in the world.
Well, I think in terms of really anyone who works in sort of disability awareness would tell you that, you can be situationally disabled, you can be temporarily disabled, and you can be permanently disabled. So situationally might be, well, you're carrying a child and therefore you only have access to one arm, for example. And then temporarily would be if you break your arm and you can't. And then a third way would be if you don't have use of your arm for whatever reason. And that is something to think about when we talk about people being disabled by society. That's the social model of disability rather than their condition disabling them. It's the way that we create our spaces and our places that mean that this is why there's this issue. And so really recognizing that this could happen to anyone at any time on a situational, temporary or permanent basis, we really ought to be thinking about it a hell of a lot more than we do. And unfortunately, the disability voice is desperately quiet, especially in architecture, where only 1% of architects declare that they have a disability.
Wow, another damning statistic. So I guess, yes, if you haven't experienced a disability, either, as you say, situationally or temporarily, it would be very difficult for you to empathize with the person who has and understand from their perspective what it's like to navigate spaces and places with that limited capability.
I feel like I ought to just double check that stat in my book. Only because whilst you're going, not declared as ARB statistics, not declared as disabled 99%. Yeah, that was correct.
Right, so I think this is a great time to come to the book specifically. So give us an overview of the book. As you said in your intro, you're purpose-led and mission-led. What is the mission you're setting out to achieve through the book?
Well, I suppose if I were to summarize it, it would be to say this, that unless we are consciously building inclusion into our world, we're almost definitely unconsciously building in exclusion. And therefore, the book is called Building Inclusion to make sure that people are being intentional and conscious and thoughtful and considerate of inclusion. And how do we respect, value, accept difference as we do various things in the built environment professions, from attracting a diversity of people into our organizations, treating, progressing, retaining that diversity, dealing with underrepresentation at every level, how we then create inclusive design, products and services, and then how do we inclusively engage with external stakeholders, users, customers, clients, communities. So it's the behaviours as an overarching perspective and underpinning principle to delivering inclusive culture and strategy across what I call those 4 pillars: attract, retain, create, and engage. And really being very thoughtful about the introspective work that's required in order to do that. And starting with that behavioural piece, talking about the governance and support, time, resource, effort, agency, and money to deliver on that. The kind of motivations, bias, psychological safety piece as well. And then those policies, procedures and practices across attract, retain, create and engage. And very much coming back to that idea that because it's about that introspective, this is what I can do as an individual, these are the changes that I can make. That is why we can create change, because it's in our hands to do so.
Amazing. And obviously we had the pleasure of launching the book with you, and the launch in London, particularly the launch in Leicester, was excellent as well. But you stood up on stage and you spoke directly to the audience, and you asked them to rise to the occasion, and it was all about change and be the change you want to see. So putting it back to you, Marsha, what is the change you want to see?
I would like to see people take responsibility for what they can do to create the change. And I think that when we look at the majority demographic of those who lead our organizations across the built environment, we talk about the white Eurocentric, heteronormative male, based in London, recognizing that if we want to create an inclusive society, this is about culture and behaviours. This isn't about something that other people are responsible for. It's very much about that leadership obligation to be able to do those things. And so the change I would like to see is to have those doors and minds open to recognizing that this is something that they can take responsibility for, rather than thinking that it's somebody else's problem, and that there really isn't anything that they're going to lose out from. There's no sense that an inclusive place like Vienna and the Aspen neighborhood that's been made more accessible for women excludes men in any way. And I tend to say it's inclusion for all, or it's not inclusion at all. There's no demographic that is outside of inclusion. And so that is why I tend to as well talk about inclusion rather than diversity, because when we talk about diversity, again, people seem to think that that is somebody else. This is very much this othering idea from it, but inclusion is really very much about calling in that conversation. So that's the change I'd very much like to see.
As would I. And going to your point about who are in leadership roles. So the Real Estate Balance it's an organization which it's in the name, it's working towards creating more balance in the real estate sector. And they release a survey every 2 years. And the 2024 survey had some very grim stats to share. And one particular one that caught me off guard was that the percentage of women in senior leadership has actually dropped from 32% in 2016 to 2015 to 25% in 2014. And I am one of those statistics. I left architecture in 2017 because I found that I'd heard of the glass ceiling, but my experience was there's not a glass ceiling above me. There's a reinforced concrete slab. And so I am part of that statistic. But Marsha, why are we going backwards? How is it that we're going backwards and not forwards?
There are a number of reasons for this, which I outline in chapter 4. But I think really importantly, though, that there is a complacency that there is around these issues. Every year people say we must do better, but very, very rarely do. I go on to talk about that none of the issues described are being tackled systemically because people don't investigate as to how. I think COVID-19 embedded some biased opinions and responses due to people being in enforced cognitive bubbles. I think there's the fallacy of unbiased behaviour because people think they're not being biased. They then embed the behaviour around, for example, hiring and salary decisions. They talk about, well, we want the best person for the job, and we're not being biased. Like, our unbiased opinion is that a man is the best person for this job. Well, they haven't, if they've not changed their processes, I'm sorry, you can't honestly say that. And there's a lack of accountability. Despite the news articles, no one is facing any consequences for not making progress. And so it would be, I at this point would say, okay, the professional institutions need to start to say they're going to mandate membership and chartership around actual explicit strategies to tackle gender discrimination, and saying, unless you meet this bar, unless you say, and this isn't about target, I'm not talking about we need 50%. This would be an outcome if systemically the issues are addressed. So, for example, progression, performance management, remuneration, there are very clear strategic steps and policy, procedures and practices that are going to create the systemic change so that getting your 50% of appropriate women at leadership level and getting women to stay in those roles, because to, the point I was making earlier, attracting a diversity of people into these professions is rarely an issue. In fact, there's a lot of effort going into that. The issue is retention, progression, and treatment. And that is about policies, procedures, and practices. So, you may well say we're dropping back. And that, to me, that's not surprising to me. You see it in the gender pay gap in architecture, it's worsening as well. So, and it's because of those things that I described there. And so but the solutions exist. They're in the book. People have tried them. They're practicing them. They're delivering on them. It's just up to these organizations to pull their finger out and actually do the work that they say troubles them so much. But we seem to be stuck in this rut of continually getting these reports, doing this research, and they're saying the same thing over and over again. We don't need any more reports to tell us what we already know. What we need is our systems, our organizations, our institutions to create some accountability, for boards to hold executives accountable for these things, and for shareholders to insist upon them as well. If you're not seeing it, this should devalue a company. That's why I think
Wow.
these are the only kinds of levers we have at our disposal.
Wow. It's a lot to unpack there, but I would love to end at least the formal part of our conversation with optimism and hope. Can we be hopeful, Marsha?
Absolutely. And this is what I'm saying. It's entirely within our hands to create these things. If we're looking at culture and behaviours, when you take responsibility for yourself, that is something. If you are responsible for your own behaviours, you are responsible for how you're acting with other people. You're responsible for, when you go into work, how you're going to implement a particular policy, procedural practice. And when you take responsibility for what you can do and influence what you can, that's entirely why we should be optimistic about these things. If we're saying, oh, we want to do this about, that identity over there, this about that identity over there, we're not going to create that change. You can't change people's identities, but you can change your own behaviours. And when you do that, then that is where it lies in our hope. And that's why I say we can be optimistic, because it's actually very, very small shifts start to make really big differences.
Well, I love that. And I think that's so true, because, this, I think there's a quote that, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world, because it's the only thing that ever has. So at an individual level, I think if we all start to behave in a way that's more human, more kind, and with more kindness and more empathy with each other, that will just multiply and amplify and trigger down the line, and the world will be a more inclusive place.
Totally. I'm here for that. I tend to say, when you change your world, you can change the world.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the key takeaway from the Building Inclusion launch. And I guess I think my final question is, what's next for Marsha Ramroop?
I hope that I will get more opportunities to speak about building inclusion, about the work, about how I can help facilitate and support that change, especially for the sector. I was lucky enough to be involved with delivering a charter based on the pillars in the book for Formula One. So I feel like if I can do something like that for Formula One, I really hope that I can do more of this for the built environment.
Absolutely. And I think, well, I know you through the built environment, but we've talked before, but what you do is in sector agnostic. So there are many places. While we're very happy to have you in the built environment, I'm sure there are other sectors out there that could benefit from your strategic advice and counsel.
I hope so. I'd love to do some more work in infrastructure, for example, because it's just a key part of building our places.
More infrastructure like the Elizabeth line.
Well, I'm here.
Well, now, so to that point, how can people find you?
So if you hop onto the interweb, www.unheardvoice.co.uk, or on socials at Marsha Ramroop.
And where can they buy the book?
Anywhere, including from me directly, where if you buy it from me directly, I'll make sure that my royalties go to charity.
Well, that's lovely. And I really do. I was very inspired at how you donated all the profits and proceeds from your brick launches to the Stephen Lawrence Foundation. I think that was a really nice, meaningful thing to do. Well, Marsha, that comes to the end of the formal part of our conversation. And now we're going to go into our Know Your Neighborhood quiz, which I know you're very excited about. And there's a lot of pressure on you to get it all right. But it's meant to be fun. So, and it's also about sharing what's special about that place and that neighborhood with the listeners out there as well. So I've definitely learned a lot about places I've, learned from all my guests on the podcast, and I hope that the listeners will too. So it's very simple. I will share a couple of facts, and you have to just tell us whether you think they're true or false, and why you may respond it in that way. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, let's do this. Okay, so Derby was named by the Romans and means fields of the deer.
It is false. It's Vikings and it means something else.
Excellent. That is correct. It is false. The Romans did not name Derby. In the late 9th century, when it came under Viking rule, as part of Dane law, the Vikings renamed the area Derby. But it does mean field of the deer. I was thinking that the field of the deer might throw you off because it sounds too obvious.
Yeah, I think so. So I know the Vikings, they did Derby and Corby. Anything that's B at the end is Viking.
Excellent. All right, moving on. Derby is home to the UK's first mechanized factory.
The world's first industrialized factory is a place called the Silk Mill. It's on the Derwent, and actually my corporate photos are taken outside it.
And so your response to that is
yes.
So it's true.
Yes, it's true.
Okay, well, that's right. Oh, we cannot outfox you. That is correct. And what's fascinating is it's not just the first fully mechanized factory in the UK, but apparently in the world.
Yes, that's right.
And it marked the start of the Industrial Revolution. So that's amazing. Yes. That's a really critical part of our history.
It's part of the it's the UN Heritage. It's the UN Heritage protected area. Yeah.
Incredible. All right. Okay. Well, let's see if we can get you this time, but I have a feeling we won't.
We'll see.
We'll see. Okay. There is a road in Derby called Lara Croft Way, and it's named after Lara Croft, the Tomb Raider.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. It's literally up there. I'm pointing out the window, up and to the right.
Okay, we got
There was basically the story about Derby's that they started the ring road in the 1950s and only got completed something like 60 years later when the Lara Croft and Mercian Way finally joined up the completion of the ring road in Derby. Yeah, so it was a big deal when it happened.
Oh my God! So that's 3 for 3, Marsha. We could not outfox you, unfortunately for us, but well done. I think you are one of the first people to get 3 out of 3. I'll say that, but it's because, like you said, like you're very much a part of local history. Yeah. So there was no way we were gonna win this time. But it was not a competition. It's just for people to learn more about Derby. But I didn't know of the Lara Croft Way. I thought it was folklore, but yeah, it turns out that is the case, and
it's real. Yeah,
it's real. So do you have like people who go, like maybe the Lara Croft fans who go and take a picture in front of the street sign and things like that?
Yeah, it happens. I think that Derby could do more to big up its Lara Croft heritage. There is a sort of street star thing.
Yes,
where it says Lara Croft.
Yes, that's part of our research as well. Yeah, we found that as well. Yeah.
But that's about it. I mean, there's nothing else. There isn't like a statue of Lara Croft or anything in the centre of town, which maybe there should be.
Maybe there's a petition out there that we don't know about.
Maybe. Yeah. No. It's pretty cool. I think we kind of love it here, but don't really do enough, I think, to celebrate what's great about the city, because those things that you mentioned there about it being the home of the Industrial Revolution, essentially, with the factory, the silk mill, it's pretty special. It's a lovely place.
Well, yeah, and I have to admit that I have never been there. But you have never invited me, Marsha. So why don't you invite me?
This is a public invitation to
me. Okay,
open invitation.
And then if you don't see a picture of us together in Derby and LinkedIn, anyway, no, so it's so true. Like the Industrial Revolution, Lara Croft, and those are things that I only learned about through my
research, and I actually went to find it. So maybe there is something that Derby can do more to celebrate and shout about it. But yeah, they can reach out to Concept Culture for that. But anyway, this has been so fun, Marsha, even though we've talked about some very hard hitting subjects. But what I've always admired about you is that you communicate them in such an accessible and intelligent way that any one of us can follow and understand what you're saying. And you don't stand on your self-righteous high horse and preach, but you want to create a space where we can all come together and have a conversation and have all our voices heard. And, we shouldn't be ignoring the loudest voices either. And I think that's what I've always been inspired by. And I think you're definitely well placed to lead the built environment into that vision that we talked about, where we are not losing women as an example, but not other underrepresented groups as well. Because to enable inclusive places, we need everybody in the room. All of us need to be in the room so that we can be involved in placemaking and creating better places, better stories, better social affection and warmth in our lives.
Well, thank you, Tanisha, for the opportunity to once again talk about these things, because as you know, I am grateful always to give the unheard voice a place to speak.
Amazing. And it has been inspiring to talk to you here on Talking Place. So all that's left for me to do is to thank you. And thank you for being a part of this conversation. And thank you for being part of Concept Culture's journey and story as well.
Grateful as always to be part of it.
We'll see you soon.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to join the conversation on social media with the hashtag #TalkingPlace. I would also love for you to leave our podcast a review and subscribe to all our podcast and YouTube channels so you don't miss an episode. There is so much more to explore when it comes to creating good places, and I'm excited to do a deep dive into other topics with you in our next episode. I'm Tanisha Raffiuddin, and it's been my pleasure to be your podcast host. Thank you for listening. See you again next time, where we'll continue Talking Place.